The elegant charity gala at the Lakeside Hotel ballroom was not the kind of place where Lynn felt she belonged. She tugged at the borrowed dress her roommate had insisted would look perfect on her, even though it felt a size too small across her shoulders. All around her, Chicago's wealthy elite clinked champagne glasses and laughed loudly about vacation homes and private schools, topics as foreign to Lynn as Sanskrit. A 34-year-old elementary school teacher with a mountain of student debt didn't exactly fit in with this crowd. "Stop fidgeting," whispered Violet, her best friend since college days. Violet worked for the event planning company that had organized tonight's fundraiser for children's music education, which was ironically how Lynn had ended up here. Violet's +1 had canceled last minute. "You look amazing. Nobody knows your dress is from a consignment shop." Lynn smiled weakly and took another tiny sip of her champagne, trying to make the single glass last all evening. The fundraiser's ticket alone would have cost her a week's salary if Violet hadn't sneaked her in. The grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, and at the far end stood a magnificent black grand piano on a small raised platform. Lynn found her eyes drawn to it repeatedly throughout the evening, though no one had played it yet. "You keep staring at that piano," Violet noted, following Lynn's gaze. "Why don't you go play something?" Lynn nearly choked on her champagne. "Are you crazy? In front of these people? No way." A waiter passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvres and Violet snagged two, handing one to Lynn. "I don't get you. You were so good. You could have gone pro." "That was another lifetime," Lynn said firmly, wanting to close the subject. "And keep your voice down." 20 years ago, Lynn had been someone else entirely, a 14-year-old piano prodigy with a promising future. Back then, she'd gone by her full name, Lynn Hong. Before years of teachers and classmates mangling it had worn her down to accepting the shortened version. Her immigrant parents had sacrificed everything for her talent, her mother cleaning houses and her father working double shifts at the factory to pay for her lessons with a renowned instructor. Lynn's fingers unconsciously moved against her glass, playing phantom notes from Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the piece she'd performed at her last competition before everything fell apart. Her father's sudden heart attack just 2 days before her Juilliard audition had changed everything. With medical bills mounting and her mother falling into depression, music had suddenly seemed frivolous, selfish even. She'd canceled the audition, packed away her sheet music, and eventually sold the upright piano that had been her most treasured possession. She hadn't touched a piano in public for 20 years. Earth to Lynn? Violet waved a hand in front of her face. "You totally zoned out. Were you mentally correcting spelling tests again?" Lynn forced a laugh. "Sorry, just tired. Third graders were extra wild yesterday. Spring fever, I think." "Well, wake up. I want to introduce you to some people," Violet said, guiding her toward a group of expensively dressed people near the open bar. "This is my friend I was telling you about," she announced to the group. The next hour was a blur of forgettable names and awkward small talk. Lynn smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals while the conversation drifted from luxury resorts in Bali to someone's new Tesla. Nobody asked what she did for a living, which was just as well. She doubted they'd be impressed by stories of helping 8-year-olds master multiplication tables. As the evening wore on, Lynn found herself once again staring at the piano while half listening to a man describe his recent golf trip to Scotland. The instrument was clearly expensive. A Steinway from what she could tell from across the room. Even from this distance, she could imagine how the keys would feel under her fingers, responsive and weighted just right. Not like the cheap keyboard she sometimes played with headphones in her apartment when the longing became too much to bear. She's actually an incredible pianist. Violet's voice suddenly cut through Lynn's daydream. Lynn snapped back to attention, horrified to realize Violet was talking about her to the small group that had now grown to include the event's host, a silver-haired woman dripping in diamonds who chaired the charities board. "Is that so?" the woman said, regarding Lynn with new interest. "What a coincidence, since tonight's cause is music education for underprivileged children." "Oh, I just play a little," Lynn said quickly, shooting Violet a warning look. "Nothing special. Just basic stuff." "Don't be modest," Violet continued, either missing or ignoring Lynn's signals. "She was headed to Juilliard before I realized I wanted to teach instead," Lynn cut in. "Violet exaggerates. I'm really quite average." But the seed had been planted. Throughout dinner, Lynn noticed people glancing her way curiously. She kept her head down, focusing on her roast chicken and seasonal vegetables, wishing she could disappear. By the time dessert was served, she thought she'd successfully avoided further attention. Then the host tapped on her microphone as waiters cleared the tables. Before we move to the dancing portion of our evening, I'd like to thank everyone for their generosity. We've raised nearly $200,000 tonight for children's music programs across Chicago's most underserved schools. Applause rippled through the room. And now, I thought we might have a little fun. I know we have some talented individuals in the room tonight. Would anyone like to share their gifts with us? Perhaps a song, a poem, or even a joke? The room fell into that awkward silence that follows such requests at gatherings. Finally, a young man stepped up and performed a mediocre card trick. The audience clapped politely. Next, an older gentleman recited a short poem he'd written. Another round of courteous applause. Lynn relaxed slightly, thinking the impromptu talent show would soon end. Then she felt Violet stand up beside her. "My friend is an incredible pianist," Violet called out, pointing down at Lynn, who felt her face flame with embarrassment. "She should play something." All eyes turned to their table. "Lynn wanted to slide under it. How wonderful," the host exclaimed, beaming in Lynn's direction. "Would you grace us with a performance?" "I really don't play anymore," Lynn protested, her voice barely audible. "Oh, come now," the host persisted. "We have this beautiful Steinway just waiting to be played. It would be a shame to let it sit silent all evening." People began to encourage her, some clapping expectantly. Lynn shook her head, panic rising in her throat. A heavy-set man in an expensive suit called out, "I'll donate an extra $10,000 if she plays something truly impressive." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Lynn realized they were treating this as a joke. The plainly dressed woman who couldn't possibly be as talented as her friend claimed. The wealthy man was essentially calling what he assumed to be a bluff, never expecting he might actually have to write that check. "You don't understand," Lynn whispered to Violet as her friend pulled her to her feet. "I haven't played in 20 years. "Not really. That's not true," Violet countered. "I've heard you playing that keyboard in your apartment when you think nobody's listening." "Those walls are thin, Lynn." Lynn felt trapped as Violet guided her toward the piano. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. The ballroom suddenly seemed enormous, with hundreds of eyes following her journey to the platform. In reality, there were perhaps 80 people in attendance. But to Lynn, it felt like a stadium. As she approached the gleaming Steinway, memories flooded back. Her father driving her to lessons in their old, rusted car. Her mother massaging her hands when they cramped from practicing. The smell of the polish they'd use on their modest upright piano every Sunday. The precise weight of her teacher's metronome ticking away as she repeated difficult passages over and over until her fingers could play them in her sleep. Lynn paused before the bench, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The host gestured encouragingly, a hint of amusement in her smile, clearly not expecting much, just humoring the situation for the entertainment of her guests. Slowly, Lynn sat down, adjusting the bench out of habit. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. 20 years of dust seemed to cover her once remarkable skill. What if she couldn't remember anything? What if she made a fool of herself? What if her fingers, now more accustomed to writing comments on student papers than dancing across piano keys, failed her completely? She closed her eyes, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips, and for just a moment she was 14 again, sitting in her family's small living room, her parents watching with pride as she practiced for the competition that would change everything. Before loss, before grief, before she packed away that part of herself and became just Ms. Lynn, the third-grade teacher who was good at explaining fractions. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in the ballroom grew heavier as Lynn sat frozen at the piano. A few uncomfortable coughs broke the quiet, and someone near the back whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "This is awkward." A ripple of nervous laughter followed. The wealthy man who had offered the $10,000 donation smirked, already reaching for his champagne glass, assuming the show was over before it began. Lynn stared at the keys, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts. She could simply apologize, claim stage fright, and walk back to her table with her head down. No one would blame her. These people didn't know her. She'd never see them again. Violet would understand eventually. But something else was happening inside her, a quiet rebellion against the past 20 years of silence. against the versions of herself she'd buried along with her dreams, against the assumption of these wealthy strangers that she was just an ordinary woman who couldn't possibly surprise them. The host cleared her throat. Perhaps another volunteer. Lynn's fingers pressed down on the keys. She started with something simple, just a few notes of a basic melody that any amateur might play. She needed to feel the piano first, to reintroduce her fingers to the sensation of real weighted keys after years of practicing silently or on her cheap electronic keyboard. The notes hung in the air, pleasant but unimpressive. A few guests exchanged glances that said, "Just as we expected." The man who had offered the donation chuckled softly to himself. Then Lynn closed her eyes. Her fingers began to move with greater purpose, building the simple melody into something more complex. The transition was so smooth that at first few noticed what was happening. But as the notes cascaded with increasing speed and precision, conversations died away. Waiters paused with trays in hand. The host's mouth opened slightly in surprise. Lynn was playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a piece considered one of the most technically demanding in piano literature. The opening was deceptively simple, which had allowed her the brief warm-up her dormant skills needed. But now, as the composition built toward its famously difficult passages, her muscle memory awoke fully. Her hands seemed to remember what her conscious mind had tried to forget. 20 years disappeared in an instant. Her left hand provided the foundation while her right danced across the higher octaves with startling precision. The piece required not just technical skill but emotional depth, and Lynn, who had spent 2 decades suppressing her feelings about music, suddenly found herself pouring everything into her playing. The grief of losing her father, the guilt of abandoning her gift, the quiet resignation of her current life. A woman at a nearby table gasped audibly. The wealthy man who had jokingly offered $10,000 set his champagne glass down slowly, his expression shifting from amusement to disbelief. Violet stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face. She had heard Lynn play through apartment walls, but never like this, never with a proper instrument, never with her full ability unleashed. As Lynn navigated the middle section of the piece, her confidence grew. Her body swayed slightly with the music, no longer stiff with fear but fluid with expression. She had forgotten the audience entirely, forgotten the charity gala, the borrowed dress, the years of silence. There was only the music now, speaking a language she had denied herself for too long. The technical challenges of the piece mounted as she approached the final section. Runs of notes that required lightning-fast finger work, dramatic dynamic shifts, and emotional control. 20 years ago, she had practiced these passages for hours, her mother bringing her cups of tea as midnight turned to dawn, her father falling asleep in his armchair as he listened with pride. Lynn's fingers flew across the keys with supernatural precision. A few people in the audience had begun recording with their phones, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The hotel staff had stopped their work entirely, standing transfixed at the edges of the ballroom. As she reached the thunderous conclusion of the piece, Lynn finally opened her eyes, catching a glimpse of the stunned faces before her. She finished with a flourish, the final notes resonating through the silent room. For a moment she sat completely still, shocked at what had just happened, almost unable to believe it had been her own hands creating those sounds. Then the room exploded. Applause erupted from every corner, startling Lynn so badly she nearly fell off the bench. People were on their feet cheering and whistling. The host was wiping tears from her eyes, careful not to smudge her expensive makeup. The wealthy man who had offered the donation appeared completely dumbfounded, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "Encore!" Lynn felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. She stood shakily, giving an awkward little bow, unsure what the proper protocol was in this situation. She hadn't performed for an audience since she was 14. The host rushed to the platform, taking Lynn's hand in both of hers. "My dear, that was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. I've heard that piece performed at Carnegie Hall, and I must say, your rendition was—" She appeared to be at a loss for words. Something Lynn suspected didn't happen often to this polished society woman. The man who had offered the donation approached the platform. Unlike before, there was no trace of mockery in his expression, only genuine astonishment. "Madam," he said formally, "I am a man of my word." He pulled out a checkbook from his jacket pocket. To whom shall I make out the $10,000? The host beamed. To the Children's Music Initiative, of course. Lynn found her voice at last. Please, this isn't necessary. I didn't play for money. Nonsense, the man replied, already writing the check. A deal is a deal. And frankly, he lowered his voice, you've earned every penny. My son studies piano at Northwestern, and he couldn't play like that if he had 3 extra hands. More guests surrounded the piano now, peppering Lynn with questions. Where did you study? Do you perform professionally? Who was your teacher? Why haven't we heard of you before? Lynn felt overwhelmed, unsure how to explain that she was just a 3rd-grade teacher who hadn't touched a proper piano in 2 decades. That music had been her first love, abandoned out of necessity and grief. That the person who had just played, Chopin, was someone she barely recognized, a ghost from her past who had suddenly taken control of her body. Violet pushed through the crowd and through, her arms around Lynn. I told you. I told them, she kept saying through happy tears. I knew you still had it in you. A distinguished older gentleman made his way to the piano. Unlike the other guests, he wasn't dressed in flashy finery, but in a simple, well-tailored dark suit. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with quiet authority. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Lynn couldn't quite place. I'm Professor Chen from the Chicago Conservatory. I would very much like to speak with you if you have a moment. Lynn blinked in surprise. The Chicago Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the Midwest. What could a professor possibly want with her? Yes, of course, she stammered. Perhaps somewhere quieter? He suggested, gesturing away from the crowd that continued to buzz with excitement. Lynn followed him to a corner of the ballroom, away from the pressing throng of admirers. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline of the performance was wearing off. She felt strangely vulnerable, as if she had revealed a secret part of herself that had been safely hidden for years. I've been teaching piano for 40 years, Professor Chen said without preamble. I've heard thousands of students, many with technical skill, many with passion, rarely both in such measure as what you just displayed. Lynn didn't know how to respond. Thank you, she said simply. May I ask why you are not on stage? Why I have never heard your name in professional circles? The question hit Lynn like a physical blow. How could she explain the complicated path that had led her away from music? The financial realities after her father's death, the responsibility she felt toward her grieving mother, the practical choices that had seemed necessary at the time. Life took a different turn, she said finally, the understatement of her existence. Professor Chen nodded slowly, as if he understood all she wasn't saying. Life has a way of doing that. But music, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Music has a way of finding its way back to those who truly belong to it. Before Lynn could respond, Violet appeared at her side, excitement radiating from her like heat. Lynn, you won't believe this. That video I took of you playing. I posted it online and it's already getting shared like crazy. People are asking who you are. Lynn felt a flutter of panic. You posted a video? Without asking me? Of course. The world needs to see this. Violet's excitement made her oblivious to Lynn's discomfort. This could change everything for you. As Professor Chen excused himself with a promise to be in touch, Lynn stood frozen, realizing that in the span of 10 minutes, the carefully constructed walls between her present and past had completely collapsed. The anonymous life she had built for herself, safe, predictable, unremarkable, was suddenly, irrevocably altered. For better or worse, the world had just heard her play. And it was listening. The next morning, Lynn woke to her phone buzzing nonstop. She squinted at the screen, still groggy from too little sleep. 27 text messages, 14 missed calls, and over 100 notifications from social media accounts she rarely used. What in the world? She mumbled, sitting up in her small bed. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The charity gala, the piano, Chopin's ballad, the applause, Professor Chen, and Violet posting that video online. Lynn groaned and pulled the blanket over her head. Monday morning meant 3rd graders waiting for their teacher. Whatever chaos Violet's video had created would have to wait. She had multiplication tables to review and spelling words to test. She shuffled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and tried to ignore the continued buzzing of her phone. As she brushed her teeth, she glanced at a few messages. From Violet. OMG, wake up. You're trending, from her mother. Why am I getting calls about you playing piano? What happened? From an unknown number. This is David Thompson from WBEZ Chicago Public Radio. We'd love to interview you about your viral performance. Viral. The word made Lynn's stomach tighten. She had spent 20 years building a quiet life for herself, and now in the span of 12 hours, that life was being invaded by strangers who had watched her most vulnerable moment. She dressed quickly in her usual work clothes, sensible slacks and a comfortable sweater, and headed out. The familiar walk to Westside Elementary usually cleared her head, but today her thoughts raced with each step. What would this mean for her job? For her privacy? Would her students have seen the video? Their parents? As she approached the school, Lynn noticed a news van parked across the street. A woman with a microphone stood talking to a cameraman. Lynn ducked her head and hurried through the side entrance, praying they hadn't seen her. "Ms. Lynn," the school secretary waved frantically from the office door. "There you are. You wouldn't believe the calls we've been getting this morning. Something about a piano video? The principal wants to see you right away." Lynn's heart sank. Was she in trouble somehow? She knocked softly on the principal's door, bracing herself for the worst. Principal Rodriguez looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "Come in, Lynn. Close the door." Lynn sat nervously in the chair opposite the desk. "I can explain." "Explain what?" "Why you never told us we had a world-class pianist teaching our third graders." Principal Rodriguez swiveled her monitor around. On the screen was Violet's video, paused on a frame of Lynn at the piano, her eyes closed, her fingers a blur over the keys. The view counter showed over 2 million. I'm not world-class. I just played a piece I learned as a child." Principal Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Lynn, I played clarinet in high school. I know enough about music to recognize extraordinary talent. This isn't just good playing, this is exceptional." She turned the monitor back around. The phone's been ringing off the hook. Not just reporters, but parents too. They're thrilled. And honestly, so am I. She leaned forward. The district's been cutting arts funding for years. Maybe this is exactly what we needed. A reminder of why music education matters. Lynn blinked in surprise. This was not the reaction she'd expected. "I've canceled your class for today," Principal Rodriguez continued. "Mr. Patel is covering. I think you need some time to deal with all of this." She gestured vaguely toward the window where the news van was parked. "But when you're ready, I'd love to discuss how we might use your talents here at Westside. Maybe start a piano program. The PTA would back it, I'm sure of it." Lynn left the office in a daze, unsure if she felt relieved or more overwhelmed than before. In the teacher's lounge, several colleagues looked up from their coffee with wide eyes. "There she is." Ms. Thompson from 5th grade came rushing over. "Lynn, why didn't you ever tell us? We watched the video this morning before school. It's incredible." Other teachers gathered around, asking questions and offering congratulations. Their genuine excitement was touching, but Lynn felt strangely disconnected from their praise, as if they were talking about someone else entirely. She checked her phone again. More messages, more calls, and now emails too. One caught her eye, from Professor Chen at the Chicago Conservatory. Subject line, "A proposition." Lynn escaped to the empty art room and opened the email with trembling fingers. "Dear Ms. Lynn, after our brief conversation last night, I found myself unable to stop thinking about your remarkable performance. Your technique, despite what you described as a 20-year absence from serious playing, demonstrates not just innate talent but the kind of foundational training that leaves an indelible mark. I have spoken with the director of our community music program. We would like to offer you a position teaching advanced piano students on weekends. The pay is modest, but the studio facilities are exceptional. Additionally, I would be honored to work with you personally if you have any interest in performing again. Talents such as yours are rare, and music has a way of demanding to be heard, regardless of how long we try to silence it. Please consider my offer. The conservatory would be greatly enriched by your presence. Respectfully, Professor Chen." Lynn read the email 3 times, her heart racing. Teaching piano at the conservatory. Working with Professor Chen? It was like being offered a glimpse into the life she might have had if her father hadn't died, if she had gone to Juilliard, if she had become the concert pianist her parents had sacrificed so much to help her become. Her phone rang, startling her. It was Violet. Finally. You've been ignoring me all morning. Have you seen the video? It's everywhere. 2 million views and climbing. Yes, I've seen it, Lynn said quietly. Violet, why did you post it without asking me? There was a pause on the other end. I thought you'd be happy. You were amazing, Lynn. People needed to see that. I didn't think. That's just it. You didn't think. Lynn's voice cracked slightly. You had no right to put me on display like that. I'm sorry, Violet said, sounding genuinely contrite. But Lynn, this could be a second chance for you. Don't you see that? All those years you spent hiding your gift. Maybe this is the universe forcing you to stop running from who you really are. Lynn was silent for a long moment. Who was she really? The promising young pianist whose future had been derailed by tragedy? The dedicated teacher who had found meaning in helping children learn? Or someone else entirely? Someone who had yet to discover what she might become? The Chicago Symphony Orchestra called my cell, Violet said, breaking the silence. I gave them your email. I hope that's okay. They want you to play at their gala next month as a special guest performer. Lynn nearly dropped her phone. The Chicago Symphony? That's impossible. I can't. You can, Violet insisted. You already did. Everyone saw it. After hanging up, Lynn sat alone in the art room surrounded by children's paintings and clay sculptures, evidence of young creativity being nurtured and encouraged. Wasn't that what her parents had done for her? Nurtured her talent, encouraged her dreams, sacrificed for her future. And then when tragedy struck, she had walked away from it all. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. Lin Hong, she said in Mandarin when Lin answered. Her mother rarely used her full name anymore. I saw you play. Someone sent me the video. Mama, I'm sorry. I should have told you. No, her mother interrupted. I am the one who is sorry. After your father died, I was lost in my own grief. I didn't see what you were giving up for me. Your dream. Your music. Lin felt tears welling up. It wasn't your fault. We needed money, not music. Your father and I needed you to be happy. That's all we ever wanted. Her mother's voice wavered. When I saw that video, I heard him again, sitting in his chair, listening to you practice. He always said your music made the whole world stop and listen. Lin couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. He would be so proud, Lin Hong. So proud to see you play again. After they hung up, Lin sat with her head in her hands, overwhelmed by the collision of past and present. Outside, she could hear children laughing in the playground. In her pocket, her phone continued to buzz with notifications, the world reaching for her, demanding a response. The art room door creaked open. Mr. Patel, who was covering her class, peeked in. Sorry to disturb you, Lin, but there's someone who insisted on seeing you. He stepped aside, revealing one of Lin's students, a small girl with glasses too big for her face. Ms. Lin? The girl approached cautiously. Is it true you can play piano like in the video everyone's talking about? Lin nodded slowly. Yes, Zoe. That was me. My mom says you're famous now. Zoe pushed her glasses up her nose. Are you going to leave our school? The question hit Lin like a physical blow. Leave Westside? Leave her students? She hadn't even considered that possibility. I don't know what's going to happen, Lin answered honestly. Everything's changing very fast. Zoe considered this solemnly. My grandma says that when things change too fast, you should sit still until the world stops spinning. Then you can see where you are. Lin smiled, touched by the simple wisdom. Your grandma sounds very smart. She is, Zoe agreed. She also says that people should do what makes them happy. She fidgeted with her sleeve. When you played the piano in that video, you looked happy. Not like when you're teaching us fractions. Lin couldn't help but laugh. Does my fraction face look that unhappy? Zoe grinned. Kind of. But that's okay. I think everybody should get to do the thing that makes their eyes light up. Like in the video. As Mr. Patel led Zoe back to class, Lin sat alone with the child's words echoing in her mind. The thing that makes your eyes light up. Had it really been so obvious to everyone but her? She opened her email and began typing a response to Professor Chen. Whatever came next, it was time to stop running from the music that had never truly left her. 3 weeks passed in a blur for Lin. By day, she still taught her third-grade class, helping with fractions and spelling tests, but her evenings and weekends had transformed completely. She had accepted Professor Chen's offer to teach advanced students at the Chicago Conservatory on Saturdays. The first time she walked into the imposing building with its marble floors and practice rooms filled with Steinway pianos, her stomach had twisted with nerves. Did she really belong here? What could she possibly teach these talented young musicians when she herself had abandoned the piano for 2 decades? Technique can be taught by many, Professor Chen had told her when she voiced her doubts. But the soul of music, that is rarer. You have both. Share what you know, and somehow she did. Her first students were 3 teenagers, all technically skilled but playing without real emotion, precisely the opposite of Lin's situation. She found herself able to help them connect their fingers to their hearts in ways their previous teachers hadn't. Play it again, she told a 16-year-old boy struggling with a Beethoven sonata. But this time imagine you're telling someone a secret you've kept hidden for years. The difference in his playing was immediate and striking. The notes remained the same, but the music changed entirely. After class, Professor Chen had nodded approvingly. You see? You have much to give. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, Lynn sat on a bench in Grant Park trying to calm her racing heart. Today was the day she had both dreaded and anticipated for weeks. Her first rehearsal with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. The invitation to play as a special guest at their annual gala had seemed impossible at first. Lynn had nearly declined, convinced they would discover she was a fraud. A former prodigy who hadn't seriously played in 20 years, whose one viral performance had been fueled by emotion and muscle memory rather than consistent practice. But Professor Chen had convinced her otherwise. They've seen the video, he'd said simply. They know exactly who they're inviting. So she had agreed, and now she was expected at Orchestra Hall in 30 minutes to rehearse Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece she had once known intimately but hadn't played in full since she was 14. For the past 3 weeks, she'd practiced whenever she could. Early mornings before school, late nights after grading papers, weekends when she wasn't teaching at the conservatory. Her fingers were sore, her back ached, and sometimes she fell asleep at the piano in her small apartment, waking with key imprints on her cheek. But gradually the music had returned to her hands. Her phone buzzed with a text from Violet. Break a leg today. The whole school is rooting for you. Word of Lynn's upcoming performance with the symphony had spread throughout Westside Elementary. Her students had made her good luck cards with drawings of pianos. Principal Rodriguez had arranged for her class to attend the performance. Even the cafeteria ladies had taken to humming classical music when she passed by. It was touching, if slightly overwhelming. Lynn still struggled with her newfound visibility. 20 years of living quietly had made her uncomfortable in the spotlight. She checked the time and stood up. No more delaying. It was time to face the orchestra. Orchestra Hall was even more intimidating empty than it would be full. Lynn's footsteps echoed as she walked onto the stage where the conductor and several musicians were already gathered. The massive concert grand piano waited center stage, its lid raised like a great black wing. Ah, there she is. The conductor turned, his face breaking into a warm smile. Our internet sensation. Lynn winced slightly at the description but returned the smile. Thank you for having me. The pleasure is ours. That Chopin was, he kissed his fingertips, magnificent, raw and polished at the same time. Quite extraordinary. He introduced her to the principal musicians who regarded her with curious eyes. Lynn knew what they must be thinking. Who is this school teacher? Does she really belong on stage with us? Shall we begin? The conductor asked, gesturing to the piano. Lynn set her bag down and approached the instrument. This was different from the charity gala, different from her practice sessions at home or at the conservatory. This was a professional orchestra, musicians who had dedicated their entire lives to music, not walked away from it as she had. She sat at the bench, adjusted its height, and placed her hands on the keys. The conductor raised his baton, the musicians lifted their instruments, and Lynn took a deep breath. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 thundered from her fingers, dark, powerful, commanding. The orchestra responded, wrapping around her playing like a wave meeting the shore. For the first few minutes, Lynn was stiff with anxiety, focusing on technical precision rather than expression. But then gradually, as the music unfolded around her, something shifted. The faces of the musicians changed from polite professionalism to genuine engagement. A violinist closed her eyes, swaying slightly. The conductor's movements became more fluid, less directive and more collaborative. By the time they reached the famous second movement, with its achingly beautiful melody, Lynn had forgotten her nerves. She was no longer Lynn the schoolteacher, or even Lynn the former prodigy. She was simply a vehicle for Rachmaninoff's music, a bridge between his world and this one. When they finished the first run-through, there was a moment of silence. Then the concertmaster, an older man with silver hair who had not smiled once during the introductions, nodded slowly. "Yes," he said simply, "this will work." The rehearsal continued for 3 hours. They stopped and started, refined and adjusted. The conductor offered suggestions, the musicians adapted, and Lynn found herself in a creative dialogue unlike anything she had experienced in her classroom or even in her lessons as a child. This was collaboration at its highest level, each person bringing their best, listening intently, working toward a shared vision of something beautiful. As they were packing up, the conductor approached Lynn. "I must confess," he said quietly, "when the board suggested we invite you based on a viral video, I had my doubts. But today," he shook his head in wonder, "today I remembered why we do this. Not for technique or precision, though yours is remarkable, but for what happens when music truly speaks through someone." Lynn thanked him, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. As she left Orchestra Hall, stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight, she felt different somehow, as if parts of herself long separated were finally reconnecting. Her phone rang. It was her mother. "How was the rehearsal?" she asked in Mandarin. "Good," Lynn replied. "Better than I expected." "I bought my ticket today," her mother said. "Front row." Lynn felt her throat tighten. "You're coming?" "Of course I'm coming. I wouldn't miss it." There was a pause. "I found something yesterday, when I was cleaning out the storage closet." "What's that?" "Your father's old recorder. The one he used at all your competitions." Lynn's heart skipped. Her father had recorded every recital, every competition, meticulously labeling each tape with dates and pieces performed. After his death, Lynn had packed those tapes away, unable to bear hearing his voice in the background, his proud applause at the end. "I listened to some of them," her mother continued. "Beijing Youth Competition, 1999. You played the same Chopin piece from the video." "I remember," Lynn whispered. "You played it differently then. More technically perfect, perhaps. But not as—" her mother searched for the word. "Not as true." That night, Lynn couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying moments from the rehearsal, notes she needed to refine, transitions that could be smoother. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely and sat at her small keyboard, headphones on so she wouldn't disturb her neighbors. As her fingers moved silently over the keys, she thought about what her mother had said. Not as true. Was that what had happened in those 20 years of silence? Had she needed to lose music in order to truly find it? Her phone lit up with a notification. Another comment on the video, which had now been viewed over 10 million times. Normally, Lynn avoided reading the comments, finding them either embarrassingly effusive or occasionally cruel. But tonight, unable to sleep, she scrolled through a few. This is what music is supposed to do, make you feel something. I've heard professional recordings of this piece that didn't move me like this. The way she closes her eyes at 2:14. That's someone who isn't playing music, she is the music. And then a comment that made her pause. I'm a piano teacher in Boston. I showed this to my students as an example of what happens when technical skill meets emotional truth. Thank you for this gift. A gift. Was that what her playing had been? Not a performance, but a gift? Lynn thought about her third graders, how their faces lit up when they finally understood a difficult concept. The gift of understanding. About her new students at the conservatory, working to connect their skilled fingers to their hidden hearts. The gift of expression. Perhaps this unexpected return to music wasn't about reclaiming a lost career or even fulfilling her parents' dreams. Perhaps it was simply about giving a gift she had kept wrapped up for far too long. Lynn closed her eyes and continued playing in the dark, the silent keys under her fingers nonetheless filling her small apartment with unheard music. In 3 days, she would perform with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, a dream she had abandoned so completely she had stopped even allowing herself to dream it. But tonight, in the quiet dark, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. The fear, yes, The inadequacy, certainly, but also the joy, pure and powerful, of finding her way back to her truest self. The night of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Gala arrived with a light autumn rain that made the city lights blur and shimmer. Lynn stood backstage at Orchestra Hall, peering through a small gap in the curtains at the audience filling the seats. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns chatted as they found their places. Program booklets were opened. Glasses of champagne balanced precariously on armrests. Looking for someone, Professor Chen appeared beside her, elegant in his dark suit. "My students," Lynn said, scanning the crowd. "From Westside. Principal Rodriguez arranged for them to come." "Ah," he nodded, following her gaze. "The small group in the left section, perhaps? They seem younger than the typical symphony audience." Lynn spotted them then, 23 third graders in their best clothes, supervised by Principal Rodriguez and 2 parent volunteers. They were remarkably well behaved, though she could see Zoe bouncing slightly in her seat with excitement. Beside them in the very first row sat Lynn's mother, looking small and nervous but undeniably proud. "Are you ready?" Professor Chen asked gently. Lynn smoothed down the simple black gown she had borrowed from Violet. Unlike the dress from the charity gala, this one fit perfectly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never played with an orchestra before." "And yet they will follow you tonight," he said with certainty. "The orchestra knows when to lead and when to be led." A stagehand approached, clipboard in hand. "5 minutes, Ms. Lynn," she nodded, suddenly unable to speak. The reality of what she was about to do hit her all at once. A month ago, she had been just a third-grade teacher, whose greatest musical audience had been her thin apartment walls. Tonight, she would play Rachmaninoff with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in front of nearly 2,000 people. "I can't do this," she whispered. Professor Chen didn't offer the easy reassurances she expected. Instead, he asked, "Why are you here tonight?" "Because I was invited," she said automatically. He shook his head. "Many are invited. Few accept. Why did you?" Lynn thought about it, searching for the true answer beneath her fear. Because when I played that night at the charity gala, I remembered who I was, who I am, and I can't go back to forgetting again." He nodded, satisfied. "Then you are ready." The orchestra members took their places on stage to polite applause. The conductor emerged, bowed deeply, and addressed the audience with a few words about the evening's program. Then he turned toward the wings where Lynn waited. "And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our special guest soloist." Lynn stepped onto the stage, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the front row could hear it. The applause was warm but tinged with curiosity. Most of the audience were regular symphony patrons who had never heard of her before the viral video. Only a small percentage had seen her play online. The rest were here simply because they trusted the symphony's artistic choices. She would have to earn their approval from the first note. As she crossed to the piano, Lynn caught sight of Zoe waving excitedly and several other students giving her thumbs up. Her mother sat perfectly still, hands clasped tightly in her lap. In that moment, Lynn realized she was playing for all of them, her students who were seeing their teacher in a completely new light, her mother who was witnessing the fruition of so many sacrifices, and herself, the self she had abandoned 20 years ago. Lynn sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and nodded to the conductor. He raised his baton, and the orchestra began the dark, somber introduction to Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. When her moment came, Lynn's fingers struck the opening chords with confidence and power. The familiar notes flowed from memory, her hands finding their way across the keyboard as if guided by something beyond herself. The orchestra surrounded her playing, sometimes supporting, sometimes answering, creating a musical conversation that filled the vast hall. As the first movement progressed, Lynn felt herself settling into the music. The hours of practice, the guidance from Professor Chen, the collaborative work with the orchestra during rehearsals, all of it had prepared her for this moment. But there was something else happening too. Something unexpected. She was enjoying herself. Despite the pressure, despite the crowd, despite the cameras recording for the symphony's archive, Lynn found herself smiling slightly as she played. This wasn't like the charity gala, where she had poured 20 years of suppressed grief and longing into Chopin's notes. This was different, a joyful reclamation of a part of herself she had thought lost forever. The audience seemed to sense it too. When the first movement ended, there was a collective intake of breath before the applause broke out, warmer and more enthusiastic than when she had first walked on stage. The second movement began, with its famously beautiful melody that had been used in countless films and commercials. Lynn knew many in the audience would recognize this part, even if they weren't classical music fans. As she played the tender theme, she glanced briefly at her students. Several were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed. Zoe's mouth was slightly open in wonder. In that moment, Lynn understood something essential. Music wasn't just about the performer or even the composer. It was about the connection, the invisible thread that linked her fingers on the keys to the children's eager ears, to her mother's teary eyes, to the concentrated focus of the orchestra around her. They were all part of something larger than themselves. The final movement arrived with its energetic rhythm and technical challenges. Lynn had worried about this section the most during her preparation, practicing the difficult passages over and over. But now, carried along by the orchestra and the energy of the audience, her fingers found their way without conscious thought. There was only the music, moving through her like a current. As they approached the final climax of the piece, Lynn felt as if she were riding a wave that had been building for 20 years. All the choices, the detours, the silences had led her here, to this moment of perfect alignment between who she had been and who she was becoming. The last triumphant chords resonated through the hall, Lynn's fingers striking the keys with everything she had, the orchestra swelling around her. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience erupted. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, not the polite appreciation of symphony regulars, but something more visceral and genuine. People rose to their feet, calling out "Brava!" and "Encore!" Lynn's students jumped up and down, clapping with their whole bodies the way children do. Her mother stood still amid the commotion, tears streaming down her face, hands pressed to her heart. The conductor extended his hand to Lynn, helping her to her feet for a bow. The concertmaster stood, leading the orchestra in their tradition of foot-stomping appreciation for a soloist they respected. Lynn bowed again and again, overwhelmed by the response, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. As the applause continued, the conductor leaned close to her ear. "They want an encore," he said with a smile. "It's your choice." Lynn returned to the piano, her mind racing through possibilities. What should she play after Rachmaninoff? Something flashy and impressive to reinforce the audience's enthusiasm, something technically brilliant to prove this hadn't been a fluke. But as she sat down and placed her hands on the keys, she knew exactly what she needed to play, not for the audience, not for the critics who would write about this performance tomorrow, not even for her students or her mother. For herself, she began to play a simple, heartfelt melody, Debussy's Clair de Lune. No orchestral accompaniment, no thundering chords or lightning-fast passages, just pure crystalline beauty that filled the hall with moonlight and memory. It was the first piece her father had ever recorded her playing, when she was just 6 years old. His favorite. As the gentle music floated over the now silent audience, Lynn closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember fully, not just the pain of loss, but the joy that had come before it. Her father's smile as he listened to her practice, her mother's hand smoothing her hair before recitals. The simple pleasure of a child discovering she could make something beautiful with just her fingers and her heart. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded away, the applause was different, softer but somehow deeper. Lynn stood and bowed one last time, then walked off stage with steady steps. Professor Chen was waiting in the wings, his eyes bright. That, he said simply, was truth. Later, after the reception where well-wishers had surrounded her with congratulations and questions about future performances, Lynn found herself in a quiet corner with her mother and her students. Zoe approached shyly, clutching her program. "Ms. Lynn," she said earnestly, "when I grow up, I want to play piano just like you." Lynn knelt down to meet her eyes. "You know what, Zoe? You don't have to wait until you grow up. You can start now." "Really? But I'm not good at anything yet." "That's the wonderful thing about life," Lynn told her, thinking of her own winding path. "We get to keep starting over. We get second chances, sometimes even third and fourth chances." Her mother placed a gentle hand on Lynn's shoulder. "Your father used to say that music is never really lost," she said softly. "It just waits patiently to be found again. As Lynn stood surrounded by her past and present, her students, her mother, the world of music she had rediscovered, she realized that the viral video that had started this journey wasn't just a moment of unexpected exposure. It had been an invitation to remember her true self, and finally, after 20 years of silence, she had answered.